There is a specific kind of silence that fills a room when a family's money is being divided. It isn't uncomfortable, exactly. It's more deliberate than that. Everyone in the room is performing composure, and everyone knows it, and nobody says so. I've sat in a lot of quiet rooms in my life. I've learned to read them. The conference room at Hollister and Teague on Madison Avenue was the kind of space that communicates wealth without announcing it. Rosewood table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the East River that nobody looked at, because everyone was looking at the attorney, and the attorney was looking at the folder. My name is Bennett Crockett. I was 38 years old on April 12, 2026. I worked as an architectural drafter at a mid-size firm in Westchester County. I made $68,000 a year. I had been at that firm for 11 years. I was not a licensed architect. I had failed the licensing exam twice, once at 26, once at 28, and after the second failure, my father sat me down at his kitchen table and said quietly, without cruelty, "Bennett, maybe architecture isn't for you." He didn't say it to wound me. He said it the way a man says something he has already concluded, and the concluding, in his mind, was a kindness. It saved me from further effort in a direction he had decided wasn't mine. My father, Dalton Crockett, was not a cruel man. He was a man of preferences, and his preference, plainly and consistently, was my older brother Preston Crockett, 5 years older, Columbia Business School, Vice President of Crockett Realty Group at 30, Executive Vice President at 37, a house in Scarsdale, a Bentley Continental, a wife named Cressida who smiled with the precision of someone who had practiced it. Preston was the visible estate. Everything about him was designed to be seen. I was the drafter. I sat in an open-plan office in White Plains and produced technical drawings that architects signed their names to. I was good at it, patient, detail-oriented. Senior architects requested me by name because my documents never needed revision. But I was not executive material. My father told me that directly, once, and I had been replaying it quietly for 12 years. My parents died 10 weeks apart, my father first, in January of 2026, my mother 3 weeks after that. The funeral was attended by 300 people who had known my father's money and 12 who had known my mother's heart. Preston gave the eulogy. He spoke about legacy. I spoke for 90 seconds. I thanked my mother for teaching me that careful work was worth doing. Nobody was looking at me anyway. The will reading was straightforward, in the way that lopsided things are sometimes straightforward. Preston received the Scarsdale residence, both vehicles, 100% of Crockett Realty Group, and $4.2 million in liquid assets. I received a 220-acre parcel of land in the Brooks Range region of Alaska, a single-structure wood cabin on that parcel, $12,000 in travel funds, and a handwritten letter from my father, sealed, to be opened only upon my arrival at the cabin. The room went quiet in a particular way. My fiancée, Mackenzie, sitting to my left, went through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. Shock. Calculation. Something that was not quite rage but was close enough to it that I recognized it immediately, because I had seen it before, pointed at other targets. Preston looked at his lap. Cressida covered her mouth. The smile that followed wasn't hidden well enough to matter. The attorney, Granger Teague, looked at me with the mild patience of a man who has witnessed many families divide things and has learned not to editorialize. "Mr. Crockett, do you have any questions?" "No, thank you." I meant it. I didn't have questions. I had a letter, and a key, and $12,000 that was exactly enough to get me to a cabin in Alaska and back if I was careful. I am always careful. On the Metro North back to Yonkers, Mackenzie spent 34 minutes texting someone, her sister probably, and did not look at me once. When we got back to our apartment on Warburton Avenue, she said, "We need to talk about this." I told her I was going to Alaska. She told me that was a waste of vacation time, that the letter would say my father loved me and was sorry, that it wouldn't fix anything. I told her I was going anyway. She looked at me for a long moment, not with disappointment, but with the particular expression of someone who is recalculating. We had a September wedding scheduled, a venue deposit, an invitation list, a color palette. "Okay," she said finally, "let's have dinner Thursday." Just us, Preston and Cressida, and Bronwyn and Arlo. Let's process this as a family. I agreed. I should not have agreed. But I was 38 years old, and I had spent my entire life agreeing to small requests from people who loved me less than I loved them. That muscle, the one that says no, had not yet developed. It would. That same week, in fact. Thursday, April 14th, 2026. Our fourth-floor walk-up on Warburton Avenue. Dinner for 6. Mackenzie had made braised short rib with polenta. She had opened 3 bottles of wine by 7:30 and had consumed most of one of them herself by 8. Preston and Cressida arrived at 7:15 with a bottle of Barolo that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Bronwyn and Arlo, Mackenzie's closest friends, a publicist and a lawyer, arrived at 7:30, well-dressed, charming, and present in the specific way that people are present when they have been invited to witness something. I noticed that. I filed it away. The first hour was controlled. Preston was careful. Cressida was polite. The conversation moved through the safe corridors of real estate, renovation plans, the Connecticut market. Preston was expanding Crockett Realty. He was acquisitive and expansive and genuinely unaware that any of it landed heavily in the room. He wasn't trying to rub anything in. Preston has never, in his life, considered whether his success might feel heavy to the person sitting across from him. That isn't malice. It's a specific kind of blindness that comes from spending 43 years in the foreground of everything. Around 8:45, he mentioned the cabin, not cruelly, just conversationally. "Bennett, have you thought any more about Alaska? What are you actually going to do up there?" "Read the letter, see what my father wanted me to see." "Fair, I respect that." He raised his glass. "To Dad, who was complicated but cared in his own way." And then Mackenzie laughed. Not a small laugh, not a chuckle that could be excused as nerves or wine. A full, loud, theatrical laugh that crossed the dinner table like a weather event and stopped every other sound in the room. Bronwyn looked at her. Arlo looked at his plate. Cressida looked at me. "I'm sorry," Mackenzie said, still laughing. "I'm sorry, I can't do this. I can't sit here and watch Bennett pretend that flying to Alaska means anything." "Mackenzie." I said it quietly. She didn't stop. "His parents left him nothing. Preston got the house and the cars and the $19 million company, and Bennett got a letter. A letter. And he's going to fly to Alaska and read it and come back and tell us it's meaningful." I did not respond. I have learned, over many years, that there are moments when the most powerful thing a person can do is simply not fill the silence. Let the other person use up all the air in the room. Let them finish. She finished. She told me she had been trying to figure out for a year why she was still with me. She said she had felt sorry for the boy whose parents never thought he was enough. She said she had hoped I would step out of Preston's shadow. She said I hadn't and I wouldn't. She said my parents had confirmed in writing what she had been afraid of for 12 months. Then she said it, directly, in front of 6 people, including my brother. "You are a pathetic loser, Bennett. I've been saying it to myself for months." She stood up, grabbed her purse and her coat, apologized to Bronwyn and Arlo, nodded at Preston and Cressida, left the ring on the bathroom counter, and walked out. The door closed, the hallway echoed. 6 people sat at a dinner table in a 4th-floor walk-up in Yonkers, and nobody spoke for 11 seconds. 11 seconds is a long time when you have just watched an engagement end in front of 2 people who were invited specifically to be there for it. Bronwyn and Arlo left within 2 minutes, with the murmured apologies of people who have been made unwilling witnesses to something private. Cressida excused herself to the bathroom. Preston and I sat alone at the table. My brother looked at me without condescension for the first time in a long time. He looked at me the way brothers sometimes look at each other when all the scaffolding of family hierarchy has been temporarily removed by something too immediate to ignore. "Jesus, Bennett, I'm so sorry." "Don't be. She was drunk. She didn't mean most of it." "She meant all of it. She's been rehearsing it for months. She just needed an audience." Preston was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're my brother. Whatever Dad did with the will, I don't feel the way she said. You're not that." "Thank you, Preston. Is there anything I can do?" "Yes, go home, take Cressida, let me pack." He looked at me. He almost said something else, and then he didn't, and I was grateful for that. He got Cressida. They left. I stood alone in the kitchen. I looked at the ring on the bathroom counter, a 1.2-carat round-cut solitaire I had spent 8 months paying off. I picked up my phone and changed my flight from Sunday morning to 6 a.m. Friday. Then I packed thermal layers, wool socks, boots, a headlamp, my father's property survey, the cabin key, the sealed letter which went into my inside jacket pocket where it would stay until I reached the cabin, because that was what my father had asked. I slept 3 hours. Then I got in a car to JFK. The driver, a man named Gideon who had been working New York for 19 years, asked where I was going. Alaska. Business or pleasure? Neither. Or estate matter? He nodded. He didn't ask more. After a few miles he said, Alaska in April. Still winter up there. Bring more socks than you think you need. I told him I'd keep that in mind. It was the most useful advice anyone had given me in weeks. The flight from JFK to Anchorage is 7.5 hours. I did not sleep. I did not watch the in-flight entertainment. I sat in a window seat somewhere over Canada and looked at the dark shape of the continent below me and thought about nothing in particular, which is different from thinking about nothing. Thinking about nothing is an absence. Thinking about nothing in particular is a kind of discipline, keeping the mind moving without letting it settle on any one wound long enough to reopen it. I was good at that. I had been practicing it for 38 years. Anchorage to Fairbanks. 1 hour. Then, a 2-hour flight in a single-engine Cessna piloted by a bush pilot named Kai Whitcomb, who flew the way experienced pilots fly, without narrating it, without performing confidence, simply doing the thing he had done thousands of times before. The Cessna made sounds I chose not to identify. Outside the window, the Brooks Range rose and spread in every direction, white and gray and ancient, a landscape that had been there long before anyone had thought to assign it a value. The airstrip at Coldfoot was not an airstrip in any conventional sense. It was a flat stretch of cleared ground beside a truck stop settlement of 34 people on the Dalton Highway. I landed, collected my bag, and walked into the outfitter's building, where a man named Orson Peacock was waiting. Orson was 61 years old, Inupiaq, short and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that has spent 6 decades outdoors and carries the evidence of it without apology. He looked at me for a moment before he spoke. "You're Bennett Crockett?" "Yes, sir." "Dalton's boy?" "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when a confirmation matches what they already suspected. "Your father was a good man. Came up here twice a year for 38 years. Never said much about what he was doing. Said he was checking on the land." "Did you know what he was checking?" Orson looked at me for a long moment. The kind of pause that Alaskans use the way other people use words. Then, "You should open the letter at the cabin. That's what he would want." "How did you know there was a letter?" "There's always a letter. Men like your father, they don't say the important things. They write them and leave them somewhere that requires effort to reach. The effort is part of the message." He rented me a ski-doo, handed me a topographic map with the cabin marked, explained the route, 22 miles northwest along a frozen river, up a draw, through a stand of spruce. He told me to leave by noon so I'd have daylight. He told me that if I wasn't back by Sunday evening, he would come looking. "You've been to the cabin before?" I asked. "Many times. I helped your father maintain it. He paid me fairly." A pause. "I will help you too, if you need it." I left Coldfoot at 11:47 in the morning. The ride took 90 minutes. I stopped twice to check the map. I saw a moose in a clearing that watched me pass without moving, with the particular stillness of a creature that has assessed a situation and found it beneath concern. I crossed a frozen creek. I climbed a shallow rise through spruce trees that stood so close together the trail between them felt deliberate, like a corridor someone had designed. And then, at 1:34 in the afternoon on April 15, 2026, I saw the cabin. It was small, 400 square feet approximately. Log construction, weathered gray by 4 decades of Brooks Range winters. A stone chimney, a metal roof, a single door facing south, windows on the east and west walls, a woodshed to the side stacked with split spruce under a tarp. a small outhouse 30 feet behind. No power lines, no wires of any kind. The nearest electrical grid was probably 100 miles south. It was exactly what Mackenzie had called it, a shack, a cabin in frozen nowhere, the inheritance of the lesser son. I parked the snowmobile. I unlocked the door with the key Granger Teague had given me in the Rosewood conference room 3 days earlier. The door opened into a single room, a wood stove in one corner, a cot against the north wall, a small table with 2 chairs, shelves with old enamel plates and cups, a lantern, a box of matches, a stack of split wood, a cabinet with canned goods my father had stocked on his last visit in September of 2025, 4 months before he died. I built a fire. I sat on the floor in front of the stove and watched my breath turn into clouds inside a wooden room my father had built, for reasons I did not yet understand. I waited 40 minutes for the air to warm enough that my fingers would hold paper without stiffening. Then I took the letter out of my jacket, sealed, my father's handwriting on the front, Bennett. To be opened at the cabin. I opened it. 4 pages, handwritten, dated November 2022, 3 years and 2 months before my father's death. Bennett, if you're reading this, I'm gone. You are sitting in the cabin I built for you in 1987, which means you took the trip. Thank you. I was not certain you would. You had every reason to assume this inheritance was an insult, and you came anyway. That tells me that the son I raised, the son I did not always see clearly, is the son I hoped he was. Preston got the visible estate. You got this cabin. I know how that looks. I need you to understand that the division was not about love. It was about fit. In 1987, when I was 32 and starting Crockett Realty, I took a trip to Alaska with a geologist named Calvin Redcliffe. Calvin was doing mineral survey work for the state under a federal grant. He was one of the best field geologists in the country, though he was never famous because he preferred Alaska to academia. Calvin showed me a piece of land in the Brooks Range that had been overlooked by every major mining company, a 220-acre parcel containing what he believed were significant deposits of rare earth elements, specifically neodymium and dysprosium. In 1987, rare earth elements had almost no market value. The major companies ignored the deposit because extraction costs exceeded returns. But Calvin told me something that changed my life. He said rare earth elements would become strategically essential within 20 years. High-performance magnets, wind turbines, electric vehicles, defense systems. He said the deposit was worth $2 to $3 million at 1987 prices. He said it would be worth 10 times that by 2007. He said it might be worth 100 times that by 2027. I bought the 220 acres, including the mineral rights. I paid $38,000. I built this cabin as cover, so that anyone who asked would think I was a recreational landowner, not a man sitting on a strategic mineral reserve. I visited twice a year to maintain the property. I told no one except your mother. In 2019, I commissioned a quiet assay from a firm in Fairbanks. The results, which are in a sealed folder under the floorboard beneath the cot, confirmed everything Calvin had predicted, and more. Bennett, the mineral rights on this land are currently valued conservatively at $87 million. Total estimated value of the property is approximately $100 million at 2022 prices, with significant upside depending on how the rare earth markets develop. Now, I need to tell you why I left this to you and not Preston. Preston is exactly who I raised him to be. Aggressive, acquisitive, skilled at moving assets. If I left him this land, he would sell it within 6 months. The deposit would become a line item in someone else's operation, and the strategic asset I spent 38 years protecting would be liquidated for a generation's worth of real estate transactions. You are different, Bennett. I know you don't see yourself the way I see you. I know I spent a large part of your life telling you that you weren't executive material, that you were better suited to careful work. I told you those things because they were true, and also because it was the easiest way to keep Crockett Realty unified under Preston and to avoid the kind of succession dispute that destroys families. I was wrong to make you feel smaller to keep the peace. I chose you for this inheritance because you are the son who reads letters before acting. You are the son who investigates before selling. You are the son who, given a strategic asset that requires patience, We'll do the careful work. The folder under the floorboard has everything you need. Calvin Redcliffe is 78 years old and lives in Fairbanks. He is expecting you. Do not rush. The land has been there for 1,000,000,000 years. It will wait for you. I love you, Bennett. I was not good at showing it while I was alive. I am sorry, Dad. I sat on the floor of that cabin for a long time. I did not cry at first. I am not a man who cries easily, but after perhaps 40 minutes of reading and rereading those 4 pages, I found that I was, quietly. Not because of the money, not even because my father had admitted he had been wrong, but because somewhere underneath 38 years of preferring Preston, my father had been watching me, cataloging my patience, my carefulness, my willingness to read before acting. And when it came time to decide which son to trust with the most important thing he had ever built, he had chosen the son who had never once felt chosen. I got up, I moved the cot, I found the loose floorboard, exactly where he said it would be. I pried it up with a pocket knife. Inside was a steel lockbox. Inside the lockbox, wrapped in waterproof plastic, was a folder containing 41 pages of assay reports, core sample photographs, chemical analyses, surveyor documents, and a handwritten card with Calvin Redcliffe's contact information. At the bottom of the card, 4 words in my father's handwriting. He is expecting you. I put everything back. I covered the floorboard. I moved the cot. I sat by the fire until it died. Then I built another one, and I slept on the cot that my father had slept on twice a year for 38 years, in a cabin that my fiancée had called a pathetic inheritance 6 hours before I left for the airport. I rode the snowmobile back to Coldfoot the next morning. The landscape looked different on the return, not because anything had changed. The spruce trees were where they had been. The frozen river ran the same line. The moose was gone from the clearing, but the clearing was the same clearing. What had changed was the person moving through it. I noticed that without sentimentality. It was simply true. Orson Peacock was standing outside the outfitter when I arrived. He didn't ask what had happened at the cabin. He looked at me for a moment, the way he had looked at me when I arrived, and then he said, "You read the letter." I did. "You understand now?" "I'm beginning to." He nodded. "Your father stood like a man guarding something every time he left that airstrip. 38 times I drove him there. A man stands differently when he's leaving something important behind." A pause. I figured it was the land. "It's the land. What's next?" "I have a list. My father left me a list." Orson looked at me with something that was not quite a smile, but was close to the satisfaction of a man who has watched a long story finally reach its next chapter. "Good. Men like your father always leave lists." Instead of flying straight back to New York, I stayed in Fairbanks for 3 days. Calvin Redcliffe lived in a modest house near the university. He was 78 years old, slight, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried manner of a man who has spent 5 decades in the field and has long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He invited me in, made tea, sat across from me at a small kitchen table, and confirmed every detail in my father's letter without hesitation or drama. Then he added more. "Your father underestimated the current value, Bennett. The 2019 assay was based on commodity prices at that time. Rare earth prices have risen significantly in the 5 years since, driven by electric vehicle demand and the global push to reduce reliance on Chinese supply chains. Your deposit today is worth somewhere between $130 and $145 million, depending on extraction partner negotiations and current spot prices." I sat with that number for a moment. "And you're certain?" Calvin looked at me over his tea with the particular patience of someone who has never needed to oversell a thing in his life. "I've done mineral surveys in Alaska for 51 years. Your father's deposit is one of the 5 largest untapped rare earth reserves in North America. The reason it hasn't been developed is because it sits on private land with mineral rights held by a single owner. First your father, now you." He set down his cup. "The major mining companies have been trying to find a way to approach your father for over a decade. He never responded. He wanted you to be the one to choose the partner." "Why me specifically?" Calvin was quiet for a moment. When he answered, it was with the directness of a man who has watched long stories play out and has no patience for softening them unnecessarily. Because your father spent his whole life watching your brother make fast decisions with other people's assets. He didn't want that to happen to this one. He wanted a son who would be careful. A pause. He had one. I flew back to New York on April 21, 2026. I did not tell Preston. I did not tell Mackenzie, who was by then already moving through her public narrative of forward momentum. Vague social media posts about trusting instincts, photographs from brunches with friends who had been present for her exit from our apartment. I did not tell my colleagues at the drafting firm. I told my supervisor I needed 6 weeks of personal leave. He approved it without question. He assumed I was still processing my parents' deaths and the end of the engagement. He was kind. He was not entirely wrong. I was processing. I was simply also doing something else at the same time. I called the consultants on my father's list. A woman in Denver, a firm in Perth, Australia, a man in Toronto. I met 2 of them in person within 3 weeks. I shared the 2019 assay. I explained the situation clearly and without embellishment. All 3 confirmed what Calvin had told me in Fairbanks. The land was worth what my father had estimated, and more. The right development path would take 3 to 5 years. The wrong path, selling outright to the highest bidder, would leave tens of millions on the table and put the deposit into the hands of an operation that would extract maximum short-term value without regard for what my father had spent 38 years protecting. I chose the Perth firm. They had the strongest track record on rare earth development partnerships. They were willing to provide upfront capital in exchange for a minority stake and responsibility for extraction planning. In July of 2026, I resigned from the drafting firm. I told my colleagues I was taking time to figure things out. They were understanding. Several of them said they were sorry about my parents. One of them, a senior architect named Diane, who had requested my work by name for 9 years, took me aside before my last day and said, "You were the best drafter I ever worked with, Bennett. I hope whatever you're doing next gives you room to show that." I thanked her. I meant it more than she knew. In October of 2026, I signed a development partnership agreement with the Perth firm. They provided $4 million in upfront development capital. Their geologists began the permitting and environmental review process. The deposit was valued in the partnership agreement at $142 million, with projected revenue over 10 years of significantly more. I did not tell Preston. I did not tell anyone in New York. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Hastings-on-Hudson, just north of Yonkers. I drove a used Subaru Outback. I wore the same clothes I had worn as a drafter. The partnership agreement was confidential, and the upfront capital was committed entirely to permits, legal structures, environmental reviews, and consultants. There was no visible change in my life because there was no visible change in my life yet. Everything that was happening underneath the surface, in the careful, patient, invisible work that I had apparently been training for without knowing it. The development was on schedule. The Perth firm completed the initial environmental impact study by summer. The state of Alaska approved the preliminary permit in the fall. Extraction was projected to begin in the 3rd quarter of 2028. First revenue distributions to my holding company were expected in late 2028 or early 2029. At current projections, my personal net worth in 2029 would be approximately $85 million after taxes and development costs. By 2035, depending on rare earth market trajectory, it could be 2 to 3 times that. I did not rush. The land had been there for 1 billion years. Thanksgiving, November 2026. Preston hosted at the Scarsdale Mansion, the house my mother had decorated in 2001, which Cressida had been quietly redecorating since February, with the focused energy of a woman who has waited a long time to be in charge of a large space. The walls were different, the furniture had been repositioned. The things my mother had chosen were still present, but they had been moved to the edges, the way things get moved when someone new takes ownership of a room and wants to be tactful about it. I brought a bottle of wine. I sat at the dining room table where I had eaten Thanksgiving dinner for 37 consecutive years. Preston was expansive. Cressida was polite. Their children, 10 and 7, moved through the house with the easy confidence of children who have never had reason to feel like they didn't belong somewhere. The meal was good. The conversation was careful. Nobody mentioned the will, or Mackenzie, or Alaska, which meant everyone was thinking about all three. During dessert, Preston set down his fork and looked at me with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and has decided now is the time to deliver it. "Bennett, Cressida, and I have been talking. We feel that you got a raw deal in the will. Dad left you basically nothing, and that doesn't sit right with us. We'd like to transfer you some money from the estate, $100,000, as a gesture. Family takes care of family." I looked at my brother. Preston Crockett, Executive Vice President of Crockett Realty Group, net worth approximately $19 million on paper, offering me $100,000 across a Thanksgiving table in the house our parents had left him, with the genuine and complete belief that he was doing something generous. He was. It was a real gesture. It was also, without his knowing it, the most clarifying moment of the entire year, because it showed me exactly how Preston understood the distance between us. $100,000. A rounding error on the asset I was quietly developing in the Brooks Range. A gesture from the foreground to the background, offered with sincerity, which somehow made it more clarifying rather than less. "Thank you, Preston. That's genuinely generous. But I'm okay." "Are you sure? You quit your job?" "I did." "What are you doing for money?" "Developing some land." A pause. "Dad's cabin?" "The property, yes." Preston laughed. Not cruelly. Just in the easy, reflexive way he had laughed at things involving me for as long as I could remember. Not from malice, but from a default assumption that what I was doing was smaller than what he was doing, and that this was simply the natural order of things. "Bennett, that's 220 acres of frozen wilderness. What are you developing? A ski resort?" "Still figuring out the details." He looked at me for a moment. Something moved across his face that I couldn't quite name. Not suspicion, not concern. Something closer to the faint unease of a man who senses that a familiar room has been rearranged slightly but can't identify what moved. Then it passed. Preston Crockett has spent 43 years in the foreground. Men in the foreground are not trained to look carefully at what's happening behind them. "Well, if you need money, the offer stands. You're my brother." "I appreciate it, Preston. I really do." And I did. I want to be clear about that. Preston was not the villain of any story I was living. He was a brother who had spent his entire life in the visible estate of our family and had genuinely, completely, never looked down into the invisible one where I had been standing the whole time. That is not cruelty. It is a specific kind of limitation, and it is more common than most people admit, and I had long since stopped being angry about it. Anger requires a belief that things should have been different. I had moved past that. I drove the used Subaru back to Hastings-on-Hudson that evening. The Scarsdale mansion disappeared in my rearview mirror, lit up, large, visible from the road. Exactly what it was designed to be. I drove north in the dark and thought about a cabin in Alaska and a man who had visited it twice a year for 38 years without telling anyone why. January 2027. Mackenzie Ford got engaged to a hedge fund associate named Colson. Her social media announced it with a photograph of her ring, a 2.4-carat cushion cut, and a caption that read, "When you know, you know." An old friend sent me the post. I looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then I put my phone down and went back to the environmental impact documentation my attorneys had sent over that morning. 47 pages of permitting language that needed my review before the end of the week. Mackenzie Ford had made her assessment of me in front of 6 people in a 4th-floor walk-up in Yonkers. The assessment had been based on incomplete information. I had no revision to offer her, and she had none to offer me, and the accounting between us was closed in the way that accounts close when both parties have received exactly what they came for. She had come for a verdict. She had delivered one. I had come for a letter. The letter had delivered something else entirely. Spring of 2027. The Perth firm's geologists completed the 2nd phase of environmental review ahead of schedule. The state of Alaska's preliminary permit was upgraded to a conditional extraction license, pending final federal review. Legal structures for the holding company were finalized. 3 additional rare earth consultants, referred by Calvin Redcliffe, reviewed the assay documentation and confirmed the deposit valuation had increased further, driven by a significant spike in neodymium demand from electric vehicle manufacturers in the first quarter of the year. My attorney called me on a Tuesday afternoon with the updated figures. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat for a moment in the 1-bedroom apartment in Hastings-on-Hudson. Through the window, the Hudson River was moving south in the particular gray-green way it moves in early spring, slow and indifferent and continuous. I thought about my father sitting in his study on a January morning, finishing his espresso, and then the heart attack that gave him 18 minutes between the last ordinary moment of his life and the end of it. I thought about whether he had known, in those 18 minutes, that the letter was in place, that the key had been given to Granger Teague, that Calvin Redcliffe had been contacted, that everything was arranged for the son who would read before acting. I think he knew. I think that was the last thing he made sure of. It is April 2027. 1 year since the will reading on Madison Avenue. 1 year since the rosewood table and the leather chairs and the particular silence of a room full of people performing composure while a family's assets were divided. I am 39 years old. I live in a rented 1-bedroom apartment in Hastings-on-Hudson. I drive a used Subaru Outback. I wear the same clothes I wore as a drafter. Nothing about my external life signals what is happening underneath it, and that is entirely intentional because my father taught me, not in person, not while he was alive, but in 4 handwritten pages left in a steel lockbox under a floorboard in a cabin in the Brooks Range, that the most valuable things are the ones nobody can see yet. Last weekend I flew back to Alaska for the annual property inspection. Same route. JFK to Anchorage. Anchorage to Fairbanks. Fairbanks to Coldfoot in Kai Whitcomb's Cessna, which still makes sounds I choose not to identify. Orson Peacock met me at the outfitter. Same snowmobile. Same 22 miles northwest along the frozen river, up the draw, through the corridor of spruce. Same cabin. I unlocked the door, built a fire, and sat on the floor in front of the stove while the room warmed. Then I took my father's letter out of my jacket and read it again. The 100th time, approximately. The handwriting had not changed. The words had not changed. But I had. A year ago, I was a drafter whose fiancée had called him a pathetic loser in front of his brother. A man who had failed a licensing exam twice, worked 11 years without advancement, and received an inheritance that the people closest to him had treated as confirmation of everything they had already concluded about him. Today, I am the sole owner of 220 acres of land in the Brooks Range of Alaska, containing one of the 5 largest untapped rare earth deposits in North America. I have a signed development partnership with a firm whose geologists are currently completing federal permitting for extraction scheduled to begin in 2028. I have a holding company, a team of consultants, and an attorney who calls me on Tuesday afternoons with figures that would have been unrecognizable to the man who sat across from Granger Teague in that Rosewood conference room and said quietly, "No, thank you. No questions. The development is on schedule. The land is patient. I am patient with it. Preston does not know. I have thought carefully about when to tell him, and I have concluded that the timing is not something I can force. It will arrive the way most significant things arrive, not dramatically, but inevitably. The tax records will grow too large to miss. The property filings will become public. The extraction operation will be visible from a satellite image. Preston will hear something from someone, or he will read something, or he will simply call me one afternoon and ask a question that I will answer honestly, because I have never been a person who enjoys withholding information from people I care about. And Preston, for all his blindness, is a person I care about. He is not a villain. I want to be clear about that, finally and completely. Preston Crockett is a man who was placed in the foreground of our family at a young age and was never given a reason to look anywhere else. He did not diminish me out of cruelty. He diminished me out of habit and out of a structural arrangement that our father designed and maintained for reasons that were complicated and imperfect and, in the end, more considered than any of us understood while he was alive. When I tell Preston, I will not do it with triumph. I will not do it with a speech or a reveal or any of the theatrical machinery that the situation might seem to call for. I will tell him the way my father told me things when he was being honest rather than strategic, quietly, directly, without performance. I will say, Dad left me something important. It took me a year to understand what it was. I think I understand it now, and that will be enough. My father was not a good father in the conventional sense. He was not warm. He did not praise easily. He managed his sons the way he managed his assets, strategically, with an eye toward long-term outcomes rather than immediate comfort. He made me feel smaller than I was for a significant portion of my life, and he did it deliberately, and the fact that he had reasons does not entirely excuse it. But here is what I have come to understand, sitting on the floor of a 400-square-foot cabin in the Brooks Range with his handwriting in my hands. He watched me. For 38 years, while I was failing licensing exams and producing careful drawings that other people signed their names to and eating birthday cake with lemon frosting because my mother remembered I preferred it, my father was watching, filing things away, building a conclusion slowly, the way careful people build conclusions, not from a single moment, but from the accumulated evidence of years. And his conclusion was this: the son who would read before acting, the son who would investigate before selling, the son who would sit with a strange and apparently worthless inheritance long enough to understand what was actually inside it. That was the son he trusted with the most important asset he had ever built. He bet 38 years of observation on that conclusion. He bet right. There is a question worth sitting with at the end of all of this, not about rare earth deposits or development timelines or the particular arithmetic of what $142 million becomes after taxes and costs and careful management over 10 years. The question is simpler than that. Have you ever received something that looked like nothing? A role that felt like a demotion, a relationship that seemed to lead nowhere, an assignment that appeared beneath you, an inheritance that the people around you treated as evidence of your insignificance? Did you open it? Did you sit with it long enough, past the embarrassment, past the other people's laughter, past the voice in your own head that had absorbed their verdict and started repeating it back to you? Did you sit with it long enough to find out what was actually inside? Because some things that look like nothing are nothing. That is also true, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Not every quiet inheritance is a mineral deposit. Not every patient man is waiting for a payoff. But some things that look like nothing are the most carefully chosen gifts you will ever receive. And the only way to know the difference is to do what my father asked me to do on the front of a sealed envelope in a rosewood conference room on Madison Avenue. Go to the cabin, open the letter, do the careful work. I built a second fire before I left the cabin this April. I sat with it until the room was warm enough that I stopped noticing the cold. Through the east window, the Brooks Range stretched in every direction, white and gray and green and silent, exactly as it had been for 1 billion years before my father bought it for $38,000 in 1987, and exactly as it will be long after everything any of us have built has been absorbed back into whatever comes next. My father sat in this room twice a year for 38 years. He built the fire the same way I built it: split spruce, dry tinder, one match. He read whatever he brought to read, or he simply sat, the way a man sits when he is in the presence of something he has protected for a long time and does not need to explain to anyone. I understand that now. I locked the cabin door, walked to the snowmobile, and started the engine. 22 miles back to Coldfoot, then Fairbanks, then New York. The land stayed where it was. It will be there when I return. It has been there for 1 billion years. It will wait.